Morning everyone, my name's Joel and I'm one of the staff team at Upton Vale Baptist Church. This morning I'm just continuing our series on reset. And you might remember in his talk a couple of weeks ago, our children's director Paul shared about being out on his paddleboard in the sea. And the point of that illustration was that he describes what happens when he stops paddling. Now, he said it doesn't mean he stops travelling, but instead of going in a direction that he wants to when he's paddling, he's instead being pulled by the tide towards land. And a paddleboard is not intended for the land. This morning, I want to expand on that idea a little bit. I want to look at the pull of the tide in the world today, which tries to pull us away from following Jesus. Hopefully, by the end of this talk, you will know how to resist the pull of the tide so that you can be intentional about discovering God's amazing way of living life. Speaking of a way, did you know that the very first Christians, they were known as the Way? And I think that's really cool. There was something so distinct and different about how they lived that being a Christian was known as the Way. Can you imagine if we were still called that today? Hey, what are you doing on Sunday? I'll be following the Way. Sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? But this is actually because of what Jesus Christ said in John 14:6. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So being a follower of the Way wasn't so much a philosophy, but a statement of who they were trying to be like. Jesus said that he was the Way. And as time went by, followers of the Way were instead labelled Christian, which means Christ-like. So it was even clearer who they were trying to become. So someone who takes the name of Jesus Christ by calling themselves a Christian should, by definition, be trying to live in a distinct way from the culture around them, just as Jesus did. In the Old Testament of the Bible, we read a command that God gave to his people, the Jews. And in Deuteronomy 18:9, God said to them, when you enter the land that I am giving to you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Don't imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. God told them to resist the pull of the tide. And in the book of Kings in the Bible, we then read that time after time, God's people, led by their kings, looked at the nations around them, at their detestable practices, liked what they saw, and failed to resist the pull of the tide away from God. They worshipped other gods. And these weren't like just different philosophies. These were horrific idols whose worship demanded rituals like child sacrifice or sending your own children into prostitution in the temples of these idols, these false gods. And so eventually, because he is a God of justice and mercy, God sent the empire of Babylon to conquer his own people and take them into captivity, to end the detestable practices that he saw among them. And that's the context of the story that we heard earlier in Daniel chapter 1. The story of a group of young men who were forcibly removed from their home, their families, and their culture, and deposited in a foreign place, in a foreign culture. And they knew that they'd been taken from Judah, their land, because of the people's disobedience to God. And so, of course, it makes a lot of sense that they didn't want to disobey any further. And so we come to our story in Daniel chapter 1, where they've been told to eat the food from the king's table, which seems to us at first not really to be a big deal. But the meat served at the king's table would likely have been meat sacrificed to the gods of the Babylonians. Indeed, a lot of the Babylonian kings declared that they themselves were gods. And because we now understand where that food came from, we understand that this choice of the young men not to eat the meat, it wasn't a dietary choice, but it was a group of faithful young people who were resisting the pull of the tide at the risk of their own lives. They didn't want to continue the disobedience to God, the pull of the tide that had landed them and all of their people in exile. And so they resisted. And when they resisted the pull of the tide, when they lived God's way instead, it says in the Bible that he raised them up to positions of success and influence. It says that they had 10 times the skill and ability and understanding of anybody else. I mean, read the rest of the book of Daniel. It wasn't easy, but when they resisted the pull of the tide, they prospered in a foreign culture, in a foreign land, by continuing to head towards God. And just like Daniel and his friends in the story from the Bible, we must intentionally resist the pull of the tide and chase after God's way. There's no neutral ground. A Christian, if a Christian isn't standing out, then by definition, they must be following the ways of the culture around them instead of the culture of Jesus Christ. Hear me clearly. If in your life you aren't going towards Jesus, then the tide of the culture around you will be pulling you away from him. So what is the culture that we have to resist? What is the pull of the tide in today's world? Because we're not resisting like detestable other gods, the attraction of evil religions. So what are we resisting? To answer that question, let me ask a slightly different one. If the devil wanted to create a culture that pulled people away from God in the most effective way possible, what would that look like in our world? I think it would be a world where we have the illusion of being connected, but no real intimacy in our relationships, because we only have to show what we want people to see. It could be a world where we find vindication for our selfishness if we search long enough for others who think and feel the same way. I think it will be a world where any product, entertainment or pleasure is available to give quick satisfaction at the push of a button, the click of a mouse, but it never truly satisfies. I think it will be a world where we were so overloaded and desensitized by graphic sex and violence that we're no longer moved to compassion and anger by the injustice, poverty and brokenness in the world around us. Does any of that sound familiar? It should. Christian author and speaker Tim Keller said in a recent podcast that culture in this age has moved from discover yourself to just be yourself. To put it bluntly, we live in a culture which tells us to make ourselves the God of our lives. We are the idol and no one has the right to disagree with who we want to be. But Jesus points us to a different way to live, a different set of values and a culture that is not of this world, but is in the world to point others to a better way. There's even a story in Luke 4 where the devil speaks to Jesus and he tempts him with pleasure, power and fame, and Jesus says no. Jesus said no to the voice of the devil. Daniel and his voice said no to the same temptations in Daniel chapter 1. There are voices trying to pull you away from Christ culture, to tell you to live in the ways of the world. The voice of the devil, the voices of those in the media, in schools, the voice of religious leaders, even sometimes the voices of our friends and families. All these things will, at different times, point us away from Christ culture and tell you that you're okay just as you are. And that is a lie. Jesus does love you just as you are. But he also loves you too much to leave you there. Our former senior pastor, Rich Webb, he used to say that we must be ready to travel from here to there. Because staying here means we stay in a place that breaks the heart of God. God's voice is speaking life and light and purpose and meaning and power and love for others over you at this very moment. But the pull of the tide would have you live only for yourself. And when you live for yourself, the world only becomes a darker place. Christian author Carey Nieuwhof writes in a recent blog that the hyper-individualism of our current culture, I'll do what I want when I want to, runs at cross purposes to the gospel and the mission of the church. And the gospel is that Jesus died. He gave up his life so that we could have life in all its fullness. But the pull of the tide, it wants to pull you and it wants to dash you on the rocks. Will you let the tide pull you? Or will you paddle with all your might as you strive to be, in the words of the ancient Christians, a true follower of the way? So take up your cross, follow him, connect in a real and vulnerable way with other people as you live a life of holiness, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Because when we do, I promise you that people will see Jesus in you. And as they see another way, they will resist the tide, put their paddle in the sea, and head away from death towards eternity. God bless you. May you resist the pull of the tide.